Today we are going to discuss existentialism. I'm sure this is one of the topics that you guys are very fascinated about, and most students, as far as I know, they are very much into existentialism. Some ideas at least they are very familiar with. In this lecture, I am going to speak about the general characteristics of existentialism, a little background to this whole movement of existentialism, the characteristics, some of the sources, and some of the important themes. So this is the focus of today's lecture going to be. Existentialism, as you may know, is a product of the 20th century, mainly an European product. But you should remember, it is not a particular school of philosophy or a school of thought. Now, why do I say that? Though there are certain common themes, existentialism is as much varied from one philosopher to another, one thinker to another. So one can think of existentialism more as a movement which is still in the making. So it is not just a finished product, it is not something very well defined. There are certain things that are very important, that are very basic, common, yes, but one cannot just limit to only those aspects. Now, existentialism has its influence, but also its inspiration in various branches of knowledge, not only philosophy, but you also find these existential questions in art, history, literature, culture, and even religion. Now, if you need to remember what existentialism is, it takes into account our concrete existence here and now very seriously. That is the focus. Traditional philosophy was rather, raising questions about things related to existence, but nothing very concrete in terms of like love, death, despair, or even the body. Traditional philosophy, even if it speaks about body, it is always in reference to something beyond us, the soul or the spirit. So this existentialism pays attention to our concrete dimension of existence, our bodily dimension of existence, and therefore our finitude, the limits that we have. We are as finite beings, we have our own despair, our own anxieties, but our own hopes. Existentialism focuses on all these aspects of life. In other words, the 20th century human being became more and more aware of his or her concrete human existence. Therefore, it is not so much into the abstraction. So, existentialism brought philosophy from the armchair to the accessibility of an ordinary human. No wonder why philosophy began to gain momentum in the 20th century. Precisely because of that, because people were not asking questions like the modern time Descartes or Hume, which are important questions, but nevertheless they are little, it goes above the head. Like for example, when Descartes keeps asking about how do I know I think, how do I know I know. People ordinarily don't ask such questions. They are good questions, but ordinary person in everyday life is not going to be interested in these kind of questions about knowledge, for example. However, existentialism is surrounded by a certain ambiguity and certain amount of confusion, because you cannot really define it. It is elusive of any kind of definition, only because the existential thinkers are varied. They cannot put them all into one category. Some would speak about the sense of individual commitment, others would speak about the intersubjective commitment. Some would be very, very theistic, believing in God and fully involved in that. Others would be declared atheist, completely in the opposite spectrum of the opposite end of the spectrum. However, there are certain things that we can see common, namely their focus on concrete existence, that make them to be known as existentialist. Also, there is a term which perhaps is a little bit of, it is vulgarized in the sense that people began calling anything and everything existentialism. It has become too banal to any type of activity or any kind of person, and this explains why Heidegger did not want to be called an existentialist, though there are a lot of existential themes in him, like for example the finitude or the anxiety, which is or death for that matter. These are all existential themes in Heidegger, but somehow he realized already in his time this has been a term which has been vulgarized to denote anything and everything, any activity of the human or any type of person. So therefore there is a certain amount of confusion there. However, we can say it is a type of philosophy that tries to analyze the basic structure of human existence. And it is also kind of a call for the individual humans to be aware of oneself, and therefore one's own existence. And remember, this one's own existence is rooted in one's own freedom. So freedom becomes one of the important themes in existential philosophy. So existential philosophy is not a system, therefore it is a way of philosophizing, a way of understanding the human life, the human reality, the human existence here and now in its concreteness, in all the dimensions that we have, including the anxious moments as well as the hopeful moments. So now existentialism therefore is not interested in retrieving eternal truths like the typical ancient or modern philosophers would think. Existentialism rather is focusing on all those aspects that form our life and that destroys our life, all that aspects that enables our freedom and all that destroy our freedom. Now this is brief idea about existentialism in general. Now let me come to the general background to existentialism. How did existentialism come to emerge? I'm sure there are more than one factor for this aspect of the advent of existentialism, but in my opinion there are two important factors that we cannot avoid, we cannot ignore. The first factor is the experience of nothingness. Now, what is this experience of nothingness? For a long time, religion had a very strong impact in human life. In fact, religion was pervasive. So slowly, religion began to decline. It loses its importance, particularly in the Western society. Also, I'm sure in many of the parts of the world, oftentimes we may confuse religion with the politics of religion, and that's not the same. The whole idea of religion, that religion is somehow center of my life, and that is a matrix that surrounds me from my birth to death. All these things is slowly lost. So the idea that we are connected to some kind of transcendent being whom we call God or by any other name. So we realize there is nothing that we can hold on to. There is nothing that gives an overarching meaning to my life. There is nothing that holds my life from the moment I am born till I die. Because religion is that which is used to give a meaning for everything that I do. So if you realize, even in every culture, you would find that there is always a way in which the meaning is given, and oftentimes by evoking certain religious practices or religious beliefs for that matter. So you realize that it's like you become suddenly a wanderer. You are completely disconnected from the transcendental realm, something that is beyond us. You are completely now disconnected from that. It's just like the earth is disconnected from the sun. I mean, that's an analogy. So you find yourself in a very dark situation, a grim situation, not because religion is all that important, but because religion had that impact all through your life. Now suddenly nothing has replaced it. That is where this question of grimness or this darkness that you have. And that is why there is a certain amount of emptiness that people began to feel in their life. So now you are not related to any transcendent being, not related to God. In fact, you realize you stand in relation to nothingness. So this is the experience of nothingness. So it is to be related to the decline of religion in the West in particular. The second important factor, as far as I am concerned, is the experience of finitude. The finitude means that we are finite beings, that there is a lot of limits and limitations in our human existence. Well, this is the experience of finitude comes from there is a certain expectation and there is what we really have it in life. So when the expectations do not meet the reality, then suddenly you realize how finite we are. Now, how does it happen in actual life, or how did it happen in the 20th century as it emerged? You see, 20th century is marked by the capitalism. Now, one of the things that capitalism was so attractive was it was something like a promised land. So it's like you are going to grow in economic and scientific aspects. There is going to be great advancement with all this technology and so on. There is going to be calculated production, and therefore we will be having great profits. So life can become materially prosperous. All these things are promises of this capitalistic system. But then this tremendous economic power of the modern time human person, the 20th century human person, is also accompanied by very many ambiguities. True, technology can create needs and they also can satisfy these needs. But then what happens is life itself is reduced to a bundle of needs and wants. So life is not seen beyond that. And precisely because of that, the human person came to be reduced in terms of the function that he or she is capable of producing. So the moment you are reduced or viewed only in terms of function, there is a sense of loss. You feel suddenly, you feel that sense of finitude very strongly. But even the material progress that was promised by the advent of capitalism was not really true. At least that was not the experience. Especially with the world wars. The very first world war shattered all this idea of material progress and stability. So despite there is certain amount of economic progress, the sense of one's own finitude, that we are very finite and therefore fragile, vulnerable, this has emerged very strong. This is also true of scientific advancements. You see, there is no limit in which science can develop, particularly science when applied to technology. So I know this century, the 20th century was crazy in that sense. It has advanced scientifically much more than so many centuries put together. So much so, there is a way in which this human technology can even conquer nature. But then, in spite of all the scientific advancements that we have, we also realize that we have not gotten rid of many of the human problems. Many of the human problems. Basically, despite scientific advancements, we still witness, observe our inability in many fronts. So, with all the capacities that science and technology can offer us, we still realize that we are radically finite. So, despite this economic, scientific growth, human person found himself standing, in the face of radical finitude, meeting the radical finitude. So this experience of nothingness with the decline of religion and this experience of finitude despite the scientific and economic growth has led to the advent of existentialism as a movement of reflection, as a movement of thinking. Now, when we say that existentialism emerged as a kind of response to this experience in human person of nothingness and finitude, it does not mean these existential ways of philosophizing did not exist earlier. It did exist already at the time of the Greek philosophy. Only thing, it did not emerge systematically as a philosophical movement. all these ideas, they are not completely new in that sense. So we do have, the source of existentialism in the ancient philosophy, in the Greek philosophy, but also we also have that in the Hebraic. When I say Hebraic, it is a whole lot of worldview that is produced by the Hebrew literature. You also find that. So in fact, we have both the Greek culture, the Hellenism, which as it is called. I shall type that word, perhaps. Hellenism. Hellenism basically is a word that denotes the Greek culture. Okay, Greek culture and thinking. And then I also put the Hebraism alongside. See, whether we like it or not, the Hebrew worldview has tremendously influenced the Western world, because the roots of Western culture and religion and civilization are to be traced back to Hellenistic culture, the Greek culture, but also to the Hebraic culture, because after all, Christianity is offspring of this Judaism, which is Hebrew, which is based on Hebrew literature, and then there's powerful influence therefore in the Western world of this Hebraism. So you see already in the Hebrew literature that you have got a lot of emphasis on these contingencies of the human nature. In the Hellenistic culture, we have this emphasis on reason, right thinking and knowledge and so on. Whereas in Hebraism, it's not so much about the right reasoning, but about learning to accept the human finitude by making a certain leap of faith. So if we can say that Hebraism stands more in terms of the leap of faith, I don't want to explain all that, because that's not our background so much in India, but we do have that today because of the influence that we have from West. But this whole question of leap of faith is very strong in the Hebrew literature. So if you, for example, there's a famous book of Job where you read, there's time and again it is a contingency of the human being and the finitude. You don't make sense of it. All that you can do is to make a leap of faith. Whereas you have this whole way in which the Hellenistic culture, ever since pre-Socrates, then later by Socratic tradition and so on, asking us to reason out everything, not to just embrace things in faith, but to reason out. So this seems to be very rivalry position between these two. But be that as it may, we cannot think of this true rivalry thing in terms of a confrontation, rather than they are very much in partnership with one another, because at the level of existence, we need both a certain amount of reasoning, but also a certain awareness of the fact that we are contingent. So it is this awareness of that we are contingent that helps us to account for all those the human issues that we face in life, the anger, the dismay, the confusion. All these things are accounted by this fact of our contingency, our finitude. So there is of course the importance of human reason, but also the human reason does not explain away everything. You cannot, by reason alone. Of course, that is one of the important things today. We realize modernity stresses too much on reason, but reason alone is not completely capable of explaining our existential issues or existential problems. So, though there is a primacy of reason that is emphasized by Aristotle, which of course later the modern philosophy has taken seriously, like Descartes and others. So the Greeks definitely focused on the human finitude as well. The Greek philosophy, though it mostly for the long time had been received in the West as a philosophy which kind of takes reason seriously and so on, slowly, gradually in the latter years, people went back to the Greek myths. The Greek myths that could convey a much more deeper meaning than these philosophical treatises that were offered by Plato or Aristotle. Therefore, let us look at in the Greek how some of these ideas were there, some of in the seminal form. They were not fully developed. For example, you have got this Socrates. Now, how does Socrates develop his philosophy? Socrates did not raise questions, or he was not interested in just raising any question. Rather, Socrates was philosophizing by posing questions on the existential experience of the people over which they can reflect. So every question that Socrates posed in all the dialogues of Plato, I don't know how many of you have read any of those dialogues, but for fun you can just have a look at them. Even if you don't read any just few pages, you can browse through any of the dialogues of Plato. Socrates begins from the concrete experience of the person with whom he is in dialogue. So he raises questions from there. It is from there Socrates makes them to reflect. The fact that Socrates has adopted a method which came to be known as the dialectical method, a kind of posing a question, then evoking a response, then based on that response, posing a counter question, then of course you evoke the response, then based on that again you pose a question, and then Socrates slowly clarifies the meaning of that by making them reflect on their concrete individual existence, not about some kind of ideals, not about some kind of already ready-made answers. No. So in that sense, remotely speaking, we can already see there is in Socrates, as part of his philosophical method, there is this whole existentialist approach which is there. Well, Socrates lived somewhere around 5th century, 4th century BCE, or BC, whatever you may call that, before the Common Era. Then we also have another famous thinker, less known in the modern times, but definitely has made an impact, by name Diogenes. Socrates, I know you all know that name, so anyway I shall type the name Socrates. Diogenes, I shall type the name. Now, Diogenes is an interesting character. He's not, he's not well, nobody discusses him today in the modern times much as people would discuss Socrates. However, he had a particular way of looking at the social, political, or philosophical questions. For example, his way of his philosophizing was in a way of evoking reflections or thinking from people by some strange propositions or some strange assertions. For example, Diogenes is said to have lighted a lantern in a broad daylight. Nobody lights a lantern in a broad daylight. And then went about the streets of Athens. And then when people are asking, what the hell are you doing? Why do you need a light? In the broad day when it's so much of sun, and then why do you need this lantern? Well, his answer was, I am looking for a human being. I am looking for a man. Now, this statement, I am looking for a man, evokes so many ideas at a time. Sure, he is seeing all these people. He is looking at all of them. They are technically human, biologically, yes. But then what he is trying to say is, yet I have not found a human. I am trying to find a human. So there is something of human existence which is not merely a biological character. The fact that you and I have a human shape, or that we may have a certain certain things that are common that brings us all under this umbrella term called humanity. No. He thinks of a certain way in which we need to live, by which we can be considered human. Our existence of being human should be manifest in a certain form of life, certain form of living that we need to adopt. In other words, Diogenes is challenging the consciousness of the humanity or the human persons. We also have a medieval thinker, early medieval stage, in the 4th century CE, Augustine. For him, philosophy cannot be purely theoretical. because anything purely theoretical has a very impersonal attitude. Philosophy should be a self-reflection. But again, this is not only Augustine who came up with this. I mean, already Socrates has this idea, but Augustine emphasizes this time and again. So the question is not so much what is man, like generally philosophers would ask the question, what is man? Who is a human being? What is a human being? Augustine says the right question would be, who am I? There is a certain amount of my personal existence that comes into play the moment I reflect about human existence, or what is human. It cannot be just an impersonal question. Who am I? It should reflect oneself. The question should start from reflecting one's own life. And obviously, his famous book called Confessions, that is very existential, very powerfully existential in nature. It's about his own life, and the reflections based on his own life. We also have a modern time philosopher by name Blaise Pascal. I don't like him for many things, but there is one thing I like him very dearly for, the idea. Well, I don't like him for many things because he's a Jansenist. Okay, Blaise Pascal is a French philosopher, lived in the 17th century. Now, Blaise Pascal, he lived at the age when astronomy began to develop. So, in the vast and silent space, because he realizes we begin to find ourselves homeless. So therefore, his focus is not so much about, until the modern thinkers of his time who would emphasize so much on the primacy of reason and so on and so forth. He said, well, the heart has its own reason which reason cannot understand. I think this is a very powerful statement. The heart has its own reason which reason cannot understand. So basically what he is trying to do is powerfully expressing the radical contingency of the human being, that we are contingent, and it's important that we are contingent. So the whole way in which the human contingency is seen is very important for the existentialist thinkers. Now, these are all some seminal thoughts that has been there over a period of time. I have not covered all of them, but some of them that I find relevant, I have mentioned here. That gave rise to this existentialism over a period of time in the 20th century. Now let us briefly look at what are some of the characteristics of existentialism. But before I do that, I shall stop for a while, and then if there is a question I will take up. If there is no question, then I will continue with the lecture. Thank you. We have talked about the general background of existentialism, the sources of existentialism, particularly mentioned some of the thinkers from the Western Greek tradition. Now we shall move on to the characteristics of existentialism. The first characteristic of existentialism is that it begins to philosophize from the experience of the human person. It doesn't begin to philosophize by asking questions like what is real, what it means to know the truth, how do we come to know. These are general questions that philosophers normally ask. But none of these things would take into account the existential experience of the human. So therefore it is a philosophy not about something. You are not studying the object of knowledge as epistemologists will do. Rather, it is a philosophy of the subject that exists. So your focus is not the object that is, but the subject that exists. Now, the human subject is also a subject who is capable of knowing. But at the same time, this subject exists concretely, here and now. So the human being as existence implies the totality of the person. We are not looking at the person in one aspect or the other. We are looking at the person in his or her entire totality. which would mean the human person is the locus or the center of feelings, actions, thought, and at the same time freedom. Traditionally, philosophers ever since Aristotle defined human person as a rational animal, an animal from the biological point of view, but distinguished by his ability to reason. So it's a rational animal. But existentialism would not consider that as the point of departure. Existentialism begins by understanding human being as existent or as existing. This existentialism or this existence that we talk about is not something that exists in itself, but existence as experienced by me, by you, by oneself. Thus, we can say that existentialism arose from the existential experience of our very existence. Now, different philosophers may have different experience of existence. Now, for example, we have got a philosopher by name Jaspers, very little known, but he also has very important contribution to make. Jaspers, for example, would say the experience of existence was the awareness of the brittleness of being. So that is, that's how he experiences existence. Now, for Heidegger, whom we have discussed already, we understand, he understands the meaning of existence, the human existence. Instead of human, he would call Dasein, as a being towards death. So the existence is seen in terms of your journey towards death. In Sartre, for example, existence is nauseating and superfluous. We will come to Sartre in detail in the next lectures. Another philosopher by name Marcel, also with regard to Buber is also a Jewish thinker. For both of them, existence is necessarily intersubjective. You don't exist just in isolation as an individual, but always in relation to someone. For Levinas is a phenomenologist. We didn't discuss him. Maybe later we'll talk about him. Levinas is a phenomenologist, but also an existential from a certain point of view, because to exist is to be ethical. So existence would imply the ethical living. So different people they understand existence from their own experience of existing. So therefore, existentialism is an attempt to philosophize from the standpoint of the actor, not from the standpoint of the spectator, from the standpoint of the self who exists. That's what I'm trying to say. The actor means the one who is reflecting on his or her existence. A spectator is an impersonal analyst. An actor, on the other hand, grapples with the questions as of one's own. So therefore, the existential way of philosophizing is not a matter of intellectual curiosity, but a matter of vital concern for oneself. Now, the philosopher Marcel, I referred to a moment ago, he makes a beautiful distinction between problem and mystery. I think that's a very relevant distinction. He has a beautiful book called The Mystery of Being. But if you have time, you can go through it. A problem can be given a solution, an exhaustive solution. A problem is something that you can solve. That's why it is called a problem. So you have a mathematical problem, you have a solution to that. Any kind of problem, you can have a solution. Some may have a simpler solution, some may have a complex solution. Anyway, you can have an exhaustive solution to any problem whatsoever. But you can give no solution to any mystery whatsoever. What is the difference between a problem and a mystery? A problem is something that is outside of you. So you can stand apart from a problem, analyze it, dissect it, and try to see how you can address that problem and offer a solution. A mystery is something which is not outside of you. You are part of it. For example, love experience, you may have some kind of arguments with your girlfriend, boyfriend, you may have some difficulty, some struggle. It's not a problem. You will never be able to get a solution to that in the normal understanding of the term. It's a mystery because you are involved in that and deeply involved in that. So that is why very often these things, that they kind of, we are stupefied before this mystery of love. Love is a mystery for that matter. You never fully get to understand that. Jokingly, my colleague used to tell me sometimes when I say, well, I find very difficult to understand people, he would say, well, you don't try to understand them, just love them. It's a fun, but I think it makes sense. Understanding would mean a certain amount in which you distance yourself. You try to analyze, dissect and see. With people you don't do that way. You cannot probably. Yeah, very interesting insight. So in that sense, philosophy is a kind of a journey in which you are deeply involved. Another characteristic of existentialism is that it functions as a corrective to the traditional tendency of engulfing the human person in the vast cosmos. What happens is we tend to see human person as a center of the universe. This is a typical modern quest as well, a very anthropocentric approach that we might adopt in our way of understanding reality. We give a unique position to human person and so on and so forth. But existentialism, rather than giving the unique position to the human person, it provides us with the contingency of human being. And then it tries to somehow uncover the meaningfulness of our existence amidst these contingencies. So you and I, we don't need to exist, but we happen to exist. How do we discover the meaning of this existence? Despite the absurdity, the dark aspects of life, existentialism gives us a ray of hope, trying to make sense of our life, trying to find meaning in our life. Note that they are not saying life is purposeful in itself. Existentialists don't say life has an inherent meaning, but we can still discover a meaning. We can still create a meaning, so to say. And that's quite interesting. Now we shall briefly discuss some of the important themes of existentialism. Now this is something that is very important, these themes, because when we discuss at least a few of them, we will go into deep of these ideas. But as of now, that we will focus generally these themes. Some of the important themes involve the question of freedom, choice, possibility and creativity. I am grouping them together. Freedom, choice, possibility and creativity. Along that you can also think of our individuality as well. Why is it, why is freedom important? Why is choice? Why is creating something out of the aspects of possibility? Why are they important? Because existence is not a static thing. It is a dynamic possibility. So it implies a constant attaining of the self-possession of the individual. To exist would imply, it's a dynamic thing, obviously. To exist as an individual would mean to become an individual. The word exist, extare, it is from the Latin, extare. The same word ecstasy comes from there, by the way. Extare simply means to stand out. You stand out from the staticity, from the static given reality. And you can only stand out when you have freedom, by making choice, by choosing from the different possibilities that exist. So therefore, existence would affirm your individuality, that you stand out as an individual from the givenness to create yourself, to make yourself from the static givenness. You don't get lost in the crowd. You shouldn't be getting lost in the crowd, or you don't escape into the crowd. To escape into the crowd would mean to escape from your individual possibilities. And therefore, it needs a courage to exist as an individual. It's much easy to get lost in the crowd. Conformity is the easiest thing. Well, everybody thinks so, so let me also think so. So if you are an existential thinker, you would try to be standing out from the rest, from the static given reality. You would be creating new possibilities. You would affirm your individuality. By choosing the possibilities, you keep creating yourself. So you as existing is not a finished given product. You are always in the making. You are in the making of who you are. This dynamic process. So this is what I have kind of grouped them together in terms of the freedom, choice, possibility, creativity, and individuality. The second aspect is the aspect of finitude. Now, again, this finitude is a comprehensive term. Let me explain that. There are various ways in which we can explain that. We always find ourselves in a particular situation, and existential thinkers call this that fact that we find ourselves in a particular situation, which is a given, which you and I did not create. Okay, the fact that you or I are born into a particular culture at a particular time, these are all givenness. This the existential thinkers call as the facticity dimension of our existence. The matter of fact, that is a facticity. They also use the word thrownness. You are thrown into the situation. You didn't come to embrace the situation yourself, but you are just thrown into the situation. Which means you didn't have a choice as regards this givenness. Now, but then you have got many possibilities. You can, within the given situation, you find out different possibilities from which you can create yourself. However, death places a limit to all these choices of possibilities. Therefore, the freedom that you experience is a very finite freedom, because you have a limit. So, you see, therefore, the fact that the death is something that ends all the possibilities. Death itself is a possibility, but it ends every other possibility. Because you find your freedom, the finitude in your freedom, it creates a certain anxiety in you. So the whole idea of anxiety, death, finitude, all these things are part and parcel of the thinking of existential thinkers. Now, along with that, they also will bring about the question of guilt and so on. I will come to that when we discuss individual philosophers, because they have a specific meaning for guilt, not psychological sense, but an ontological sense. Another important theme that oftentimes we come across in existential writings is authenticity and inauthenticity. Actually, Heidegger is the one who used this term for the first time, or he was the one who used it at length perhaps. But all other philosophers also have the same idea to some extent. Now, the way in which we make a choice, there is a constant gap. The gap is the choice that I like to make, or I make, or the choice that I should make. Now, we are constantly called to bridge this gap. For Kierkegaard, therefore, authenticity consists in becoming committed to a life of subjectivity and truth. Now, note, when Kierkegaard speaks about subjectivity, all that he is saying is that how do I find truth in this and I can commit to that? So he calls it a leap of faith. For Heidegger, authenticity or authentic human means to choose to be oneself, to choose to be yourself. In spite of the temptation to drift towards anonymity, we are very comfortable with anonymity. I mean, the proof is that we are very comfortable with social media because, we can be anything we want. To be oneself and to resist the temptation to slip into anonymity. For Marcel and Buber, whom I referred earlier a while ago, authenticity consists in life of intersubjective relation and communion. It is the I-thou relationship. It is the reciprocal way in which we lead our life. It is not that I alone matters, it's not that you alone matter, that we need to be constant interaction and involvement and engagement and relation. For Sartre, whom we will be discussing at length, authenticity would imply accepting one's freedom. If you refuse to accept that you are free, that is inauthentic. Accepting one's freedom and to be able to make choices, that is authentic existence for Sartre. For Camus, is another important, this is typical French. You write one thing and say another thing. It is not Camus or something, it's Camus. Camus, for him, authentic existence is the ability to resist the absurdity, what he calls the courageous despair. We'll come to that. I mean, life is absurd, yes, but you should try to resist all the time this absurdity. That's for Camus. So this is the third important theme. You'll find these thinkers speaking about authentic existence, all of them invariably, though of course Heidegger elaborately discusses that time and again, and Sartre also discussed that elaborately. The fourth important theme, again, if I can put it together, it is in terms of intersubjectivity, responsibility, and commitment. Now this is very typical of a few of them like Marcel, Buber, and later Levinas. All of them would like to think of our existence always in relation to others who are existing. Nobody is in that sense a solipsist. Solipsism is a view I alone exist, okay? When I say solipsism. This is a view that I alone exist, okay? When I say solipsist, it means somebody who thinks that I alone exist. Now, they take the existence of others seriously. Even if the existence of the other is sometimes, even people like Sartre, it can be a hateful stare. The gaze of the other can petrify you. So even if it is that, when you take their existence seriously. In other words, one subject is necessarily related to another subject. Now, the positive way in which this relation can be characterized in terms of commitment and responsibility. So therefore, the other person I encounter is not an object, is not a functionary, is not a problem. The other person is equally the subject. No. For Levinas, therefore, the face of the other reveals my responsibility for the other. So this idea of togetherness, this community, responsibility, commitment, these things we see time and again emerging in the writings of these existential thinkers. The fifth theme that we will be talking is the whole question of absurdity, meaninglessness, estrangement, homelessness. All these things are one and the same thing. I mean, different words, of course, with some nuances perhaps. Now, today we oftentimes speak about absurdity. It has become almost a catchword. So, the life as meaningless and so on. Now, obviously, the main spokesperson for this idea that life is inherently meaningless, it is absurd, the main spokespersons of this idea are Sartre and Camus. So, for Sartre, absurdity is basically the awareness that we are superfluous. For Camus, the absurdity is awareness that we are condemned to tragic purposelessness. Our life doesn't have any purpose, unlike people who have claimed, like Aristotle and Aquinas, who thought every life has a purpose, very teleologically it is ordained and so on. they think it has no purpose. Camus is very clearly, we are condemned to this tragic purposelessness. There's nothing purposeful. Well, but Camus also finds absurdity as the basis for the dilemma of a human person who groans under the structures of organized injustice and hypocrisy. We'll come to that when we speak about Camus in detail. The last theme that I call that depersonalization or dehumanization is another important theme that existential thinkers talk about in detail. Now, existentialism is a reaction to the reduction of human person as one of the items in the cosmos. So this somehow, kind of erodes into the human values and dignity. The human, therefore, is not an object. He is not somebody who can be depersonalized. He cannot be made into a commodity. He cannot be objectified. He is not someone to be, he or she is not someone to be used. Things are to be used. Humans are to be loved and cared for. Well, things, when I say, is inanimate things. Therefore, animals and other things also can be cared for in that sense. But of course, humans, they are not to be considered as object. That is for sure. So depersonalization can take two forms. So it can keep the humans into some kind of impersonal collectivity. So you can think of them as a crowd. Oftentimes in politics, that's what happens. Humans are seen as merely as voters. Someone whom you can manipulate and use so that you can come to power. That is a very powerful way in which they are put into impersonal collectivity. Oftentimes voters are anonymous. You don't know who they are and so on. You don't relate to them at that level. So they are characterized by anonymity and facelessness. So depersonalization also can take another form, that people can be reduced to my purpose. So much so that people can exploit them for one's own advantage. And that typically happens in the globalized world. Now, to conclude this whole introductory lecture on existentialism, including some of the important themes, we can say existentialism is to some extent based on phenomenology initiated as a method by Husserl. But at the same time, it is very different from the Husserlian phenomenology as well. You see, in Husserl's phenomenology, the essence is emphasized. If you remember, Husserl says, we have to get into the essence of things, and in order to do that, we have to bracket the existence. But for existentialists, existence is the central point of consideration. The focal point of our philosophy is the existence of the human person, of you and me, in its totality, in all aspects of life. That is the focal point. That is the center. In both phenomenology and existentialism, there is a serious attempt to do away with the subject-object dichotomy. So, even in phenomenology, we have that whole approach of doing away with the subject-object dichotomy. So also in existentialism, because the other person is not an object as well. The other person is a subject. So everybody's existential experience counts. So the existential experience and the reflections based on that can be very subjective, but so be it. Like, for example, Kierkegaard would praise that idea of subjectivity as truth, because that involves a commitment. So it is not some kind of non-committal kind of response that you can give. So we can say that existentialism is a wielding powerful influence in the thought pattern of the 20th century. It's definitely one of the important movements that has captured the imagination of the 20th century human being, and it has made powerful impact over many people, even ordinary people. Not necessarily they are philosophers, but these ideas powerfully influence every other discipline as well. So with this, I conclude the lecture for today. Thank you.